His Excellency George Washington. Chapter 1 Interior Regions. History first noticed George Washington in 1753 as a daring and resourceful 21-year-old messenger sent on dangerous mission into the American wilderness. He carried a letter from the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, addressed to the commander of French troops in that vast region west of the Blue Ridge Mountains and south of the Great Lakes that the Virginians called the Ohio Country. He was ordered to lead a small party over the Blue Ridge, then across the Allegheny Mountains, there to rendezvous with an influential Indian chief called the Half-King. He was then to proceed to the French outpost at Presque-Isle, present-day area, Pennsylvania, where he would deliver his message in the name of his Britannic Majesty. The key passage in the letter he was carrying, so it turned out, represented the opening verbal shot in what American colonists would call the French and Indian War. The lands upon the River Ohio in the western parts of the colony of Virginia are so notoriously known to be the property of the Crown of Great Britain that it is a matter of equal concern and surprise to me to hear that a body of French forces are erecting fortresses and making settlements upon that river within His Majesty's dominions. The world first became aware of a young Washington at this moment, and we get our first extended look at him, because at the widow's urging, he published an account of his adventures, the Journal of Major George Washington, which appeared in several colonial newspapers and was then reprinted by magazines in England and Scotland. Though he was only a missionary, the kind of a valiant and agile youth sent forward against difficult odds to perform a hazardous mission. Washington's journal provided the readers with a first-hand report on the mountain ranges, wild rivers, and exotic indigenous people within the interior regions that appeared on most European maps as dark and vacant spaces. His report foreshadowed the more magistral account of the American West provided by Lewis and Clark more than 50 years later. It also, if inadvertently, exposed the somewhat ludicrous character of any claim by, quote, His Britannic Majesty, end quote, or any European power, for that matter, to control such an expansive frontier that simply swallowed up and spat out European presumptions of civilization. Although Washington is both the narrator and the central character in the story he tells, he says little about himself and nothing about what he thinks. Quote, I have been particularly cautious, end quote, he notes in the preface, not to argument. The focus instead is on the knee-deep snow in the passes through the Alleghenies and the icy and often impassably swollen rivers, where he and his companions are forced to wade alongside their canoes while their coats freeze stiff as boards. Their horses collapse from exhaustion and have to be abandoned. He and a fellow adventurer, Christopher Gist, come upon a lone warrior outside an Indian village ominously named Murdering Tom. The Indian appears to befriend them, then suddenly wheels around at a nearby point-blank range and fires his musket, but inexplicably misses. Quote, "Are you shot?" Washington asks Gist, who responds that he is not. Gist rushes the Indian and wants to kill him, but Washington will not permit it, preferring to let him escape. They come upon an isolated farmhouse on the banks of the Monongahela, where 2 adults and 5 children have been killed and scalped. The decaying corpses are being eaten by hogs. In stark contrast to the brutal conditions and casual savagery of the frontier environment, the French officers whom Washington encounters at Fort Le Boeuf and Presque Isle resemble pieces of polite Parisian furniture plopped down in an alien landscape. Quote, "They received us with a great deal of complaisance," Washington observes, the French offering flattering pleasantries about the difficult trek Washington's party had endured over the mountains. But they also explained that the claims of the English king to the Ohio country were demonstrably inferior to those of the French king, which were based on La Salle's exploration of the American interior nearly a century earlier. To solidify their claim of sovereignty, a French expedition has recently sailed down the Ohio River, bearing a series of lead plates inscribed with their sovereign's seal that obviously clinched the question forever. The French listened politely to Washington's rebuttal, which derived its authority from the original charter of the Virginia Company in 1606. It had set the western boundary of that colony either at the Mississippi River or even more expansively at the Pacific Ocean. In either case, it included the Ohio country and predated La Salle's claim by 60 years. However persuasive this rather sweeping argument might sound in Williamsburg or London, it made little impression on the French officers. Quote, "They told me," Washington wrote in his journal, "it was their absolute design to take possession of the Ohio, and by God they would do it." The French commander at Fort Le Boeuf, Jacques Le Gardner, Sieur de Saint-Pierre, concluded the negotiations by drafting a cordial letter for Washington to carry back to Governor Dinwiddie that sustained the diplomatic affectations. Quote, "I have made a particular duty to receive Mr. Washington with the distinction owing to your dignity, his position, and his own great merit. I trust that he will do me justice in that regard to you, and that he will make known to you the profound respects with which I am, sir, your most humble and most obedient servant." End quote. But the person whom Washington quotes more than any other in his journal represented yet a third imperial power with its own exclusive claim of sovereignty over the Ohio country. That was the half-king, the Seneca chief, whose Indian name was Tenacherisan. In addition to being a local tribal leader, the half-king had received his quasi-regal English name because he was the diplomatic representative of the Iroquois Confederation, also called the Six Nations, which is headquarters in Onondaga, New York. When they had first met at the Indian village called Lockstown, Tanner Cherison had declared that Washington's Indian name was Conotocaris, which meant town taker or devourer of villages, because this was the name originally given to Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, nearly a century earlier. The persistence of that memory in Indian oral history was a dramatic reminder of the long-standing domination of the Iroquois Confederation over the region. They had planted no lead place, knew nothing of some English king's presumptive claims to own a continent, but they had been ruling over this land for about 300 years. In the present circumstance, Tanner Cherison regarded the French as a greater threat to Indian sovereignty. Quote, "If you had come in a peaceable manner like our brethren, the English," he told the French commander at Paris Ile, "we should not have been against your trading with us as they do, but to come fathers and build great houses upon our land and to take it by force is what we cannot submit to." End quote. On the other hand, Tanner Cherison also made it clear that all Indian alliances with European powers and their colonial kinfolk were temporary expediencies. Quote, "Both you and the English are white. We live in a country between. Therefore, the land does not belong either to one or the other, but the great being above allowed it to be a place of residence for us." End quote. Washington dutifully recorded Tanner Cherison's words, fully aware that they exposed the competing, indeed contradictory, imperatives that defined his diplomatic mission into the American wilderness. For on the one hand, he represented a British ministry and a colonial government that fully intended to occupy the Ohio country with Anglo-American settlers whose presence was ultimately incompatible with the Indian version of a divine providence. But on the other hand, given the sheer size of the Indian population in the region, plus their indisputable mastery of the kind of forest fighting tactics demanded by wilderness conditions, the balance of power in the looming conflict between French and England for European domination of the American interior belonged to the very people whom Washington's superiors intended to displace. For several reasons, this story of a young Washington's first American adventure is a good place to begin our quest for the famously elusive personality of the mature man who became a monument. First, the story reveals how early his personal life became caught up in larger public causes. In this case, nothing less grand than the global struggle between the contending world powers for supremacy over half a continent. Second, it forces us to notice the most obvious chronological fact, namely that Washington was one of the few prominent members of America's founding generation. Benjamin Franklin was another, who were born early enough to develop their basic convictions about America's role in the British Empire within the context of the French and Indian War. Third, It offers the first example of the interpretive dilemma posed by a man of action who sees determined to tell us what he did, but equally determined not to tell us what he thought about it. Finally, the most importantly, it establishes a connection between Washington's character in the most formative stage of its development and the raw, often savage, conditions in that expansive area called the Ohio Country. The interior regions of Washington's personality began to take shape within the interior regions of the colonial frontier. Neither of these places, it turned out, was as vacant as it first appeared, and both of them put a premium on achieving mastery over elemental forces that often defied the most cherished civilized expectations. Let me stop here.